So as you hopefully all know, today's topic is going to be practical approaches to pest management. And I know we've got quite a mix of experiences in the audience, from beginner to very experienced. So hopefully there'll be something in here for all of you. But obviously, if I haven't addressed anything that you'd like specific advice on, please do put a question in the chat and I'm more than happy to help answer that. Just another disclaimer, I had a nasty batch of hay fever yesterday, so apologies if I have to have to sneeze or blow my nose occasionally. I'm really sorry about that. But that's what it is. So let's get started. So what we're going to cover today is basically on the page in front of you. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just to introduce museum pests. So when we talk about museum pests, what are we talking about? What are the pests that specifically affect museums? How do they damage collections? What kind of damage are you expected to look out for? What kind of collections do they damage? Also a large section of identifying museums pests, which is a large part of integrated pest management. It's a really important part to identify what pests you're dealing with, because that will affect what collections are damaged and the extent of the damage. And after that, we're going to move on to looking at methods for prevention. So preventing pest problems, pest infestations, and also monitoring the pest activity in your museum and how to record that. And then lastly, we're just going to touch on what treatments are available for when that prevention hasn't quite worked and we need to do something more about that. Okay. So what do we mean by museum pests? So basically, very simple, they are pests that cause damage to museum objects, museum buildings, anything that can threaten your collections. So we mainly group these into three different types of pests. They are borers, so pests that bore into the material that they're eating. So for example, if you look at the wood on this side, you'll see that something has bored into the wood, causing damage, tunneling through the wood, and eventually this has caused the wood to fail as the amount of tunnels replaces the substrate, and therefore you get structural failure. So they're borers, and they include things like furniture beetle, deathwatch beetle, particularly wood borers. And the second type of museum pests that people like to group in are shredders. And these pests shred material as they move across it, eating it and digesting it. So they include moths and carpet beetles. And you can see here, these moths have had a bit of a nibble at this textile, leaving, so they've nibbled at the weft threads. They've left, so the top threads, and they've left the underlying threads in place. So they've moved across and left holes. And again, here we can see some moth damage and some carpet beetle damage on textiles and taxidermy. And the last type of category of pests, museum pests, that we're going to look at are grazers. And these include things like silverfish and book lice. And they graze the surface of materials, so things like paper and books, leaving transparent patches, areas of scratching, and then eventual loss. So there are the three different types of damage that you'll see in museum collections. So before we go on to look at each of these creatures more individually, it's important just to have a look at the life cycles of these insects, because we need to understand this in order to be able to identify them, but also to be able to prevent and remove them. So first off, we've got the life cycle of a typical pest beetle. So you can see there's 4 major stages. There's the adult beetle that lays an egg, which then hatches into a larva. The larva in this case is the stage that causes all of the damage. So it's the larva that attacks materials, collections, eats that, grows big and fat, and then pupates into an adult beetle. So it's not, although we might see the beetle more often than we see the larva, and it's the beetle we identify, it's the larvae that do all the damage. So that's important to know. And this life cycle is very dependent on the environmental conditions that it takes place in. So each of these different stages will take a different amount of time depending on the species of beetle, but also because of the environmental conditions that it takes place in. So usually for beetles, if the environment is damp and humid and warm, then the life cycle is quicker to take place. So that means there might be multiple life cycles in place of one full life cycle in drier, cooler conditions. And it's important to know that the final stage, so the larva turning, pupating into the adult, normally takes place in spring, early summer, when temperatures rise, but this can be confused indoors, particularly in heated spaces, as the beetles mistake heating in the autumn as well for the warming temperatures, and then can pupate there. So if the conditions are favourable, you can have more than one generation of beetles in any one year. So it's important to remember that, and when to look out for this last stage, because that's when you'll see the beetles, and that's when you'll know there's a problem if you haven't noticed the damage. So if you look at the life cycle of a different museum pest, so moths, which are also very common pests, you can see it's sort of similar. You have the adult moth, they lay eggs, they then hatch into larvae, and then they cocoon before turning into the adult moth. And again, it's the larvae that do all the damage. Again, you might not see the larvae in action. You are more likely to spot the moths, but you may very well see the larvae on textiles and taxidermy. And again, this is dependent on environmental conditions and the type of moth. So in warm, humid climates, you will have a faster life cycle, and therefore more moths being produced, more larvae, more damage. And again, you'll see the emergence, the larva pupated, the larva cocooning and turning into moths in the spring period where temperatures rise. And again, if you have heated buildings, possibly in the autumn when you switch your heating on for winter as well. So it's very similar processes, and the same things to look out for. One that I'm just going to look at, this is the life cycle for a silverfish, but it can also represent the life cycle for a book louse. So instead of the larval stage, you have an egg, an adult silverfish lays an egg, and then instead of larva, it has young. So these are often called nymphs, and they look exactly like the adult insect, except they're smaller, more translucent. You don't often see them, you normally see the adults. But again, it's the growth stage that causes all the damage. So as they're growing, they're eating and continually getting bigger. And again, creatures like this, they have faster life cycles in damp conditions, damp, dark conditions. So the more damp your environment, the more pests you are likely to see. So now we've had a sort of bit of an introduction about the life cycle of pests. we get a bit of a more concentrated look on the different specific species. So first I want to introduce you to the death watch beetle. You may, if you don't have any experience of using pests, this is one you might have heard of because of the folklore of it being associated with death. What happens is the beetles bang their heads against wood to attract their mates, and people who used to sit up with the dead on all-night vigils used to hear the banging, and that's how it comes to be associated with the death watch. But more scientifically, these are the things to look out for. So they're quite big for an insect pest. So the adult can be 6 to 9 millimeters long. The larvae is a bit smaller and obviously starts off smaller and grows before pupating. Deathwatch beetle like hardwoods, but very rarely attack anything that hasn't already been damaged by damp. So they like oak, but there has to be some sort of damage, damp damage, to let them be able to digest and attack the wood. So conditions, they like the dark and they like the damp, obviously. So generally they can't thrive in below 75% RH. So if you are sure that your environmental conditions are below that, then, and you have no microclimates near wood or anything like that, then you are unlikely to have a problem with deathwatch beetle. They're also very geographically specific. So I know that as far as I'm aware, there's not been any records of these appearing in Scotland, but in the south, so the area that South East Museums are in, they are active, so you could possibly have a problem with these guys. So what kind of damage are you looking out for? So I've explained a bit about beetle life cycle. So it's the larvae that do the damage. So the beetles lay their eggs on the substrate of the material that they eat, so wood, and the larvae tunnel through the wood eating and leaving very distinctive round frass pellets. So frass is the materials they leave behind after they've been attacking and eating the wood. And then once the larva pupates, the adult beetle emerges from the wood to mate, and they leave round 3 millimeter flight holes, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. But more specifically, the beetle looks dark brown, elongated, with patches of yellow scales on the wing cases, as you can see in this picture. The head isn't usually visible from above. What you can see at the top is the thorax, and this is tricorn in shape, so like Nelson's hat. And the larvae, which do all the damage, you're unlikely to see unless you can do a close examination of an infested piece of wood and you're lucky to see one poking out. They're creamy white and very curved C shape in shape with little short legs, but it's the beetle that you're most likely to be able to see and identify. So this is an image of their round flight holes. So you can see multiple flight holes here, and they are quite big, much bigger than flight holes of similar insects. So we'll look at a furniture beetle next, and their flight holes are much smaller. So this is quite an identifying characteristic of the damage. And again, the frass is also very identifying. It's round, large pellet shaped, so it's unlike frass from other insects. So this is the other beetle, the wood-boring beetle, that sometimes is confused with the deathwatch beetle. This is the furniture beetle. So again, it's a dark brown elongated beetle with lines of punctures on the wing cases. Again, the head isn't visible from above. It's the thorax again, so the body and the thorax, that's visible. And the thorax is very strongly humped, unlike the deathwatch beetle, so that's the main characteristic of that beetle. So they're a bit smaller, they're about 3 to 4 millimeters long, and the larva again is smaller, between 0.5 and 5 millimeters long. Again, they attack wood, but they attack most wood apart from sound heartwood. So again, they like wood that has already been affected by damp. And again, they like dark and damp conditions, but unlike the deathwatch, they can survive in a little bit lower RH, so above 55 RH. And again, the larvae are the ones who do the damage. The beetles land on the material that they like to eat, lay their eggs. The larvae tunnel through the wood, in this case leaving a coarse and gritty frass, unlike the rounded pellets of the deathwatch beetle. And then once they've eaten their fill, they pupate into the beetle, which then emerges from the wood, leaving smaller flight holes than the deathwatch beetle. So to identify this creature, you're looking for them specific flight holes, the specific type of frass, and also dead and stunned beetles near the wood. So something like this, you can see the smaller flight holes and the coarse, gritty frass surrounding it. And again, it is the beetle you're more likely to see and identify as they emerge from the wood, but it's also possible for you to see larvae as they're eating the wood. So here you're in for a treat with 2 little larvae emerging there. And again, this type of flight hole damage that you're seeing. So inside this bit of wood, the tunnelling damage is probably quite extensive, and you don't normally see the full amount of damage until there's enough tunnelling to cause structural damage. So it can go very quickly from minor damage to major damage without too much notice. So it's important to keep an eye on it. Okay, so moving away from wood borers, we can have a look at a different type of beetle, carpet beetles. So these are slightly different beetles to the wood borers in the fact that they are classed under shredders. So they attack animal specimens, fur, feathers, woolen textiles, anything that's sort of animal related. So in the wild, they'll also be found in birds' nests and anything where there's animal and insect remains. So I've grouped a varied and Guernsey carpet beetle together because they are very difficult to tell apart and they do the same kind of damage. So there's a picture of the 2 different beetles here, and then their larvae, which again are very difficult to tell apart. The adult are 2 to 3 millimeter long, so very small, and the larvae are again quite small, 0.5 to 5 millimeters long. And again, they like warm and damp conditions. And like I say, the larvae also nicknamed woolly bears because they look a bit like woolly bears. And they leave neat holes behind in what they're attacking. And they also, as woolly bears, they tend to shed their skins quite regularly. So you'll find empty woolly bear skins and frass left behind as they grow. So like I say, the beetles are often hard to tell apart as well. They're small, round beetles covered with grey and gold scales. Some scales get lost as they age, which shows the black of the beetle underneath. And they have a prominent head, which you can see there, not just the thorax. And they have clubbed antennae, so you can see on the bottom picture a little bit of the clubbed antennae there. So really the only way you can tell these beetles apart is by looking under a microscope, specific shape of their scales. The varied carpet beetle has more teardrop shaped scales, and the Guernsey has more triangular shape scales, but normally as the damage and prevention are similar, it's not always necessary to tell them apart. Okay. So we can see the kind of damage they do here. This is a woolen felty textile, and you can see the carpet beetle larvae here, and they've just nibbled little holes as they've grazed the textile. And this is a photo of the woolly bear skins that have been shed. So this isn't actually a pest, it's just the skin they've left behind. So you might find this left on textiles that have been attacked. So very similar, we've got two different types of carpet beetle, which do differ slightly to the previous two, so I've grouped them apart. So this is the two-spot and the vodka carpet beetle. And again, the adults are 4 to 6 millimeters, so they're quite small, and larvae can be a little bit bigger than the previous carpet beetle, so they're a little bit elongated. But again, similar in that they're quite furry, but they also have these longer hairs as a tail. And the beetles themselves can be told apart. So the one on the left is the vodka beetle. So it's oval brown beetle with a black thorax and head. And the wing cases are covered in little short hairs. And this is the two-spot beetle here, with nicely, well, you can't see quite as clearly in this photo as possible, but there's 2 white spots, one on each of the wing case. And again, they attack the same things: animal specimens, fur, feather, woolen textiles, and again, they like the warm and damp, and they leave the similar amount of damage. The only thing to sort of note is the vodka beetle is quite a recent addition to the UK, and its spread isn't quite as widespread as other carpet beetles. So at the moment, it's only been definitely identified in London, as well as sort of smaller outbreaks in Birmingham and other major cities, but it's not quite as widespread as the others. And then we've got a biscuit drugstore beetle, so called because its major source of food is biscuits. So it likes food products and starchy organic materials, as well as pharmaceuticals, which also explains its other common name as the drugstore beetle. So again, this is quite a small beetle, 2 to 3 millimeters. And again, the larvae are a similar size. So it's reddish brown oval beetle with hairs and parallel lines on the wing cases. And the antennae have 3 shape segments at the end. And again, the larvae are creamy white and C-shaped, so not unlike the other beetle, the wood borer beetle larvae that we were talking about before. So again, it's the larvae that do the damage, and they tunnel into the materials such as biscuits and other dried organic materials, and they leave round exit holes and very fine powdery frass. So something like this. So these are their very round exit holes with a few biscuit beetles on the surface as well. And I think second to last beetle that we're going to talk about, this cigarette beetle, so called because they like to feed on tobacco products, but as well as food products and other organic materials. So if you've got any botanical specimens, dried botanical specimens or book bindings in your collections, then you may find them there. They like warm temperatures, so their life cycle increases in warm temperatures, and therefore increases the amount of beetles that you've got to deal with. So again, they're sort of oval reddish brown, and but their wing cases are covered in little hairs. And then their antennae are notched a little bit like the teeth of a saw. They have very similar larvae to the other beetle larvae that we've been talking about. And again, they produce fine powder frass, but they are more classed as shredders rather than borers, these ones. So you don't quite have the exit holes that you do with other beetles. The cigarette beetle, as well as the drugstore beetle, are very attracted to light. So when they emerge from their food source, you may find their dead beetles near windows or near light sources. So that's a good way to identify if you've got problems with these beetles. Just have a look near windowsills to see if there's any dead beetles around there. And the last beetle before we move on to exciting moths, this is a spider beetle. So these guys are about 5 to 7 millimeters long and are very hairy and superficially look like a spider, hence their name. So they focus on vegetable and animal detritus, including paper and wood. They also go for insect collections and animal skins. But they can also tunnel into hard materials such as wood when they're ready to pupate. So again, it's the larvae that do most of the damage. And when they're ready to pupate, they bore into hard materials to create a safe place to turn into the fully grown beetle. And they can tolerate lower temperatures than other beetles, but high temperatures can really increase their life cycle, creating more beetles. So we've got two different types of common spider beetle here. The left-hand image is a golden spider beetle. So it's got a long-legged golden body covered in golden hairs, and the body is quite globular, so sort of more rounded than other spider beetles. And on the right, we've got the Australian spider beetle, which is a brown beetle with hairs and lines on the wing cases, so a bit like a furniture beetle. And then it's got the thorax with 2 cushions of hairs. So when looking for the damage they do, they leave sort of irregular holes in materials and cavities in harder materials. And you're more than likely to find adult beetles on traps. So something like this. So here, a wooden material, a larvae has eaten into it to pupate. So you've got these little cavities left on the surface of material, so they can cause quite a lot of damage. And spider beetles are very often found in birds' nests as well. So particularly in cavities and up chimneys, that's where you're likely to find them. Okay, let's move on to moths. So these have the different life cycle that I was talking about before. So slightly different in that they cocoon rather than pupate, but again, it's the larvae that do most of the damage. So web-enclosed moth are probably the most common moth affecting collections. They are quite small and covered in silver grey scales, so whitish gold scales, sorry, with a head with a brush of orange hairs and long thin antennae. The larvae are white with an orange-brown head capsule, and they're often hidden by tubes of silk webbing. So as they move across the animal semen, fur, wool and textile that they're digesting, they spin silk across the material, so it almost looks kind of like spider webs across the material. And they can also leave behind pellets of frass. And again, like beetles, they like the dark and warm and moist conditions. So this is the webbing damage that you're likely to see. So you've got the moth down at the bottom left, and then in the centre you've got lines of webbing along with the sort of gritty frass that they leave behind. So if you can't quite make out the damage or see the holes that they've created, you will probably be able to see that. And again, the second very similar moth to the webbing clothes moth is the case-bearing clothes moth. And again, these are very common. So similar in size, 8 to 10 millimeters long, and the larvae are very similar, except as the larvae eats, it spins a cocoon around itself, leaving both ends open, but it keeps the cocoon around itself as it moves across the material it's eating. So if it works, I've got this little video to show you, which just shows you the larvae emerging from its little cocoon and then pulling the cocoon along with it. So that's quite a special video there if you're interested. Well, you are obviously interested in pests because you're here. Sorry, didn't mean to play that again, but it's so interesting. I'll let it play. There we are. And then, so they're the main two moths that you need to be worried about, but there are other moths that you might see in collections, but they generally are very rarely likely to damage clean and dry textiles. So they need very damp conditions where things are already starting to deteriorate. So these are the white-shouldered house moth on the right, so called because very clearly has white head and shoulders. So that's very easy to identify. And then the brown house moth on the left. So these are similar size, a little bit bigger than the others, 8 to 10 millimeters long. Larvae are very similar, white. But they do need very humid conditions. So we won't worry about them too much. And just a few more pictures of larvae. So here we've got, on the left, we've got the webbing clothes moth larvae, and then a webbing clothes moth next to it. And you can see the damage they've done here, and the frass in little globules next to it. And then on the right, the resolution is not very clear, but I believe these are case-bearing clothes moths. So you've got the larvae inside a little case, and it's shredding the material that it's eating. And again, this poor little monkey has a moth problem in his ear. As you can see, the moths emerging from his ear, which suggests that the larvae have decided to cocoon in there, and these are the moths emerging. So I promise you the identification section is nearly over. We can nearly have a breather. But just want to go over a couple more pests. So these are pests that don't fit under beetles, don't fit under moths. They're just other insect pests that can affect museum collections. So that includes the common silverfish. So these are quite long. The adult can be 10 to 15 millimeters long. They look a bit like a flattened fish or carrot shaped, but they're silvery grey. They have long segmented antennae. Their body is covered in scales. So almost, if you're a Doctor Who fan, it almost looks like something that could belong to the Cybermen. And then it has 3 tail-like appendages. So if you remember what I said about their life cycle earlier, when they hatch from eggs, they don't come out as larvae, but they come out as young, which are called nymphs. So they grow from 2 millimeters to 10 millimeters long before they turn into a fully fledged adult. And the nymphs are normally quite transparent. And silverfish like materials that contain starch, so things like paper and books, anything that has some sort of starchy glue residue. And it also likes microscopic traces of mold as well. So these guys like really dark and really damp conditions. So if you see a silverfish, it is an indicator of a damp microclimate somewhere in your museum. And the damage you're likely to see is ragged or scraped and grazed areas on paper, areas that have become transparent, and then eventual loss. And then we've got the grey silverfish, which is a newer addition to the UK Museum Pests group. It's not spread very widely so far, but there has been more sightings of it. It is bigger than the common silverfish, so it can be about 15 millimeters long or longer. It has longer antennae and longer tails. And instead of being silvery, it's more dull grey, hence its name, grey silverfish. But it likes the same kind of food. There's ongoing research, but it suggested that this silverfish can survive in lower RH, so it may become a bigger problem in museums. And again, it creates the same kind of damage. And lastly, with insect pests, we've got the book louse. So these guys are very, very tiny. They're less than 1 millimeter long, and they're wingless, and they reproduce differently in the fact that they reproduce by parthenogenic reproduction. So there's no males and females. They don't need fertilization in order to reproduce. Each adult lays eggs and they hatch into nymphs, and then the cycle goes on, so they don't need to mate. It's down to the conditions in which they're living in, how fast they reproduce. So again, they like dark and damp conditions above 60% RH. And they like starch materials, again, like silverfish, such as books and paper and microscopic mold. And again, their damage is very similar to silverfish. They graze the surface of books, but because they are so small, it needs an awful lot of them and a lot of time to create a lot of damage. But that does mean it can creep up on you. So you can go from thinking that everything's fine, leaving everything as it is. But if you get a big infestation, then it creeps up slowly, but then surely it's there. So here's some pictures, examples of damage of silverfish and book lice. You can see they've just grazed the surface, and then eventually they create holes after a large infestation. So I just want to take 5 minutes just to talk about non-insect pests, non-pest insects, sorry. So these are things that don't directly damage collections. So things like black ground beetles, ants, ladybirds, spiders, cluster flies. However, their presence can cause a problem. So if you are finding on your pest traps a lot of spiders, ground beetles, ants, they can be an indicator as to how other kinds of pests are entering the building. So these pests tend to be bigger than museum pests, so they're more identifiable and you can see where they're entering, so near doors, windows. But also, unfortunately, they are a food source for other pests. I've said with quite a few of them, they like animal specimens and animal products in museum collections, but they also like wild animals as well that have died. Things like spider beetles and carpet beetles will feed off carcasses of other pests. So if you have other pests entering your building and dying and you're not cleaning them up, they can be a source of food and harbourage and encourage other problematic pests into your museum. So it's best to clean them up. but also fungus and plaster beetles, as well as wood lice. They can be indicators of damp. So wood lice, they do eat wood, but the wood has to be very, very damp for them to actually be able to eat it. So they don't often affect museum collections unless there's been, you know, a very bad damp problem. But in the structure of your museum, if you see wood lice, then you know you have a damp problem that you need to rectify. So for example, on a blunder trap, this ground beetle's got trapped. He's not a problem for us, he's obviously just wandered in accidentally and got caught. But unfortunately, if you turn him over, he's being eaten by a museum pest. And I can't quite see, but I believe it might be a woolly bear of some sort. So you can see that might be a problem. And just very quickly before I stop for questions and a breather, so non-insect pests, we can have rodents and birds and bats. If they get in accidentally, then they can cause damage. So rodents, they like to shred materials in order to create nests. So they can cause huge amount of damage if they are so inclined. Mice are also incontinent, so they leave a little trickle of urine everywhere they go, so they can be very damaging. And mice can also get in to very small spaces, so any gap you can run a pencil under, a mouse can get in. Birds can fly in accidentally through windows, doors, but obviously their bird droppings can cause damage, and their nests, as I've mentioned a few times, can be a home for insect pests such as carpet beetle and spider beetle. Bats also, you might find bats in your attics. Bats are protected species, so they're quite difficult to deal with in the usual way. You've got to seek advice from the Bat Conservation Trust or similar before you try to solve your problem. But bats can cause damage. Their urine is very alkaline, so it can corrode objects, especially metals. So it's just, these are more obvious pests that you can identify, but it's just to remain vigilant that they can cause problems quite quickly. And again, you've got a photo of a little pigeon here who's lost his way and become trapped in a historic building, and a squirrel as well who's found his way into a historic building. So I'll stop there for a little bit for questions, because I know we've covered an awful amount, and don't worry if you've not followed some of that. I will provide notes. It's just useful to run through the main characteristics just as a reminder or as an introduction, but don't worry, I will provide you with handouts, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.
We've got 2 questions in the chat, but please feel free to use this opportunity to type in extra questions as well. And there will be no quiz on the creepy crawlies. So the first question is, we get webbing clothes moths in one room where we have a carpet rug starting about 1 foot away from the skirting board. We have bare floorboards next to the carpet, but it sits on 3 layers of synthetic mats. How could we treat the area? Would desiccant work? And if so, where would we put it, given the carpet is a few layers above the floorboards?
Okay, let's see. That was a lot of information. So it's how to treat your webbing clothes moth in a carpet.
In a carpet, 1 room. The carpet starts 1 foot away from the skirting boards, bare floorboards next to the carpet, but it sits on 3 layers of synthetic mats. Okay, yeah.
Carpets are a problem. Is it the entirety? If it's the entirety of the carpet that's a problem, or if it's an area that's particularly dark, so if it's underneath furniture and not very accessible, the major thing would be to keep housekeeping standards up. So if the carpet is stable and quite robust, then it's important to vacuum regularly. in order to make sure they're disturbed regularly, because moths don't like to be disturbed. So if you are disturbing them regularly, then that will help. Underlay can be a problem because obviously it's good for carpets, but it is difficult to get to. So it is important on a regular basis, regular meaning, you know, once a year or however many times you have your deep clean, to make sure you are getting to the underlay. So vacuuming the underlay as well, treating the underlay. So we have things like Constrain, which is a pesticide, which I'll explain in more detail later on. So you can spray the area, particularly the underlay. If the underlay is non-historic, you'll probably want to spray that more often than the carpet, which is historic. There are other treatments that you can do. I've not used different desiccants myself, because I know there's been difficulty in recent years with things that have been used quite regularly being now banned under health and safety things. So I need to remind myself what is and isn't allowed, because we have been in some museums recently where they've still been using something that they've been used for years, but in recent years has been banned. So it is important to know what is and isn't allowed health and safety wise, as well as what is okay to use on historic collections. But I can maybe provide more detail. I'm sure Carolyn will provide me with the questions, and I can maybe provide more detail afterwards. That helps.
Second part to this question, or second question, what are your thoughts on using exosex products to coat male moths in female pheromone? We have never put out pheromone traps to monitor case bearings, clothes moths. Is it worth doing, or would you only put them out if you've seen the moths lying around?
So the first part of that question, I personally, I haven't dealt with the treatment, the gender targeting treatment of moths, but I have read about it, and I know National Trust are doing some experiments at the moment, which I'll also talk about later. They are trying it out to see in theory, the gender confusion treatment is meant to confuse males so that they don't mate with females, and therefore disrupts the life cycle. And I know there has been some success in some museums, but I'm not sure whether they've got a full-blown conclusion on whether it's more effective than other treatments yet. And as for pheromone traps, they are useful, particularly if you know you've got a problem, and if you want to direct that problem to see where things are coming from. So yes, they are useful, but if you haven't noticed any particular damage or any particular moths flying around, then it might not be necessary for your museum. If you've got a room with lots of textiles, lots of animal specimens, and you are worried, then I would say, yeah, it's worthwhile getting the pheromone traps for the specific moth that you think might be a problem. And even if you just monitor that for a year and then look at the results and say, well, there's not really been a lot of finds here, then you might say, oh, we don't need to do pheromone trapping, we can just do the normal blunder trapping until you have reason to suspect that it's increasing. But it depends on the circumstances. So I hope that's helped.
Another question in. So for the past 3 years or so, we've had moths, particularly up a chimney, but there's no food source other than a very expensive piano, and in brackets it says felt, which is barely touched. We can see the moths flying around, and we are bemused as to why we have them and why they're still there. The chimney's been fogged twice. Any ideas? P.S. I've been using Constrain spray and it sort of works.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It might, if you fog the chimney, have you swept the chimney recently? Because fogging does work, but I suppose you can get birds' nests quite often up chimneys, and obviously they build nests every year. So if they're building a nest every year and creatures come and then you fog, it might only be a short-term solution. So I just wonder whether if you do regular sweeping of the chimney, I'd have to think again, but if you don't, it might be worthwhile doing a regular sweep.
It says the chimney's been capped for 15 years.
It's been capped, okay. That's a tricky one then. If you've not noticed any damage, or if you don't know, it's worth thinking about whether there might be any other dead spaces. So if you've got floorboards, is there any way things can drop below the floorboards? Is there any way, have you checked the cap? Is it still intact? So yeah, it's difficult to have any more suggestions without sort of seeing the space, but yeah, if you're not noticing any damage, then obviously it's a problem you want to solve, but it's, yeah. Yeah, but if you want to provide more details, if you think there's any more dead spaces that could be a problem, and yeah, constrain, people particularly recently, I think there's been a change in recipe that I think is not quite as efficacious as it used to be, but different museums have different ideas on that. So yeah, it sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't. I don't know why.
Okay, and the follow-up was that they've checked the floorboards, but we'll check the cap.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another question in. I've only seen silverfish on hard floors. Just wondering if they can survive or move about in or on carpet as well.
Yes, I have seen some of the information sheets. I've not seen it myself, but some of the information sheets say that they can actually attack textiles in certain conditions. So if they've got surface dirt or mold, or so food starchy sources on top of the textile as well, so they can certainly move across and potentially damage textiles as well. And I think they're meant to leave sort of a yellowy stain behind as well as they do. But yeah, silverfish are very mobile and can move quite quickly, particularly if disturbed. Yes, so yes, I suppose the answer is, I think.
And that's all the questions we have for the moment. But like I said, if any questions pop up later while Charlotte's presenting, feel free to put them in the chat.
Great. Well, I'll continue. Right, so hopefully, obviously the identification stuff, there's a lot to take in and it can be quite dry. So hopefully the next part will be a bit more faster flowing, have a few more different interesting things to talk about. So prevention. So it's important when thinking about how to prevent pests. Obviously, we've all heard the idea that prevention is better than a cure. That's true for a lot of things, but it's also true for integrated pest management. And that is why we have integrated pest management things in place, because it's very, as we've heard with a few of them questions already, it is harder to eradicate pests after they've taken hold. So it's important to try and preempt any problems. And in order to do that, we need to sort of think, why do pests come inside? What are they looking for? So I've put a few things down here, but I mean, there are probably other things as well. If you have anything to contribute, then please do contribute, because it'd be great for us to discuss and for other people to think about as well. So mainly, why do pests come inside? So to look for somewhere dark and safe to lay their eggs. Like most creatures, they're their purpose in life is to reproduce and keep their life cycle going. And it just so happens that somewhere dark and safe to lay their eggs. Museums are very often dark and safe. We don't often disturb areas such as stores and exhibitions. So there are lots of different places where they think might be a good place to lay their eggs. Another reason might be to hibernate over winter. Our buildings are generally warmer, we have heating. Even if we don't have heating, they're sheltered. And even non-museum pests such as ground beetles and spiders, that's exactly why they come in our houses, because it's warmer, and they want somewhere to hibernate over the winter. Also food sources, and again very closely associated with that, harbourage sources. So materials that can be used to eat, materials that can be used to nest in. We have a lot of materials in museums that are perfect for this. So not only do we have collections which are made of all sorts of yummy ingredients like textiles, taxidermy, wood, we also have lots of packaging materials normally which can be used as harbourage. We have a lot of dead spaces, including dust. We get visitors which increase our dust levels, and things are kept in the dark for quite long periods of time. So there's, you know, safe place, food, a place to make your bed. That's all reasons why pests might choose your museum. And then lastly, accidentally, pests might not know that they're particularly in your museum. They've just wandered in because there's something, you know, food-wise over there. Yeah, so again, ground beetles, you often find them on traps near doors. They've just accidentally come under the door. They've just been walking and they've not really known that they've come inside. So having known these reasons why pests come inside, we can also have a think about how they get inside. So we know why they might want to, and then this is how can they do that. So this will help with some of the questions earlier, hopefully, or give you something else to think about. There's not always an easy solution. It might be a combination of things. So obviously gaps in the fabric of the building. So things like air conditioning ducts, or any sort of ducts that expel air from the inside to the outside and the other way around. Any damage to the building. And obviously we're talking about very small pests here, so gaps in the fabric of the building don't need to be, they might not be obvious to us, but they might be very accessible for bugs. So obviously, this has been mentioned before in one of the questions, but chimneys. If you're in an old building, obviously some museums don't have chimneys, but older buildings tend to. They tend to have been closed up either recently or a long time ago. They are not always as sealed as you think they are, so caps need checking, and occasionally if the cap hasn't, or the seal hasn't been as effective for long, you often find that things have accumulated. So even if you repair the cap, you might need to sweep the chimney. Open doors and windows, obviously we have visitors. Visitors aren't the only things that can come in through doors. Windows might be opened on hot days, and things can come in. People, so people might bring bugs in with them on their shoes, but also on their clothing if they have a bit of a clothes moth problem at home. English Heritage did an interesting survey a couple of years ago about asking people to put traps in their houses and see what they find. And and quite a lot of people found clothes moths in their own home. So it's possible if you wear a woolen jumper into a museum, you've got a clothes moth problem at home, you might be bringing clothes moths into the museum. So new accessions as well. So if your museum is actively collecting and you've got a new accession from a loan or a donor, and they come into the building, they might be infested, and they might bring pests into the building. Also dressing, so people, obviously, we all do, we like to make museum exhibitions people friendly, so that might involve dressing it up a bit with extra dressing, particularly at Christmas. We like Christmas trees and tinsel, anything that's brought in, particularly live things like trees, they might have pests on them or be infested. So a museum I used to work in used to have a large dressing up section for children, and that was the source of most of our moth problems. And as well props, so if you have any interpretation or like I said, trees or tinsel, you might be bringing things in there. So with all that in mind, how can we work to prevent pests? So obviously, first answer will be to remove the pest access routes that we've just been talking about. So if things are getting in through the doors and windows, can we make sure we've got bristle strips on the bottom of doors to make sure there's no gaps? Can we make sure when we open windows we put fly screens up to avoid beetles flying in? Can we box or cover collections in store to make it harder for pests to access them? Do we have good building maintenance? So are all holes filled in adequately? Are air ducts got filters to prevent pests coming the other way? Anything like that? Is there any vegetation close to the building that could harbour pests? So do you have trees and bushes right up against the building? They can support pests, which can then only one small step when you're in the museum. So it's important to make sure that if you do have vegetation, it's not right next to the building. And then you've got other things. So we've talked about pests coming in the winter for because it's nicer conditions inside. So how can we control the environment to discourage this? So all the way through the pest identification, I think I must have said this with every single one, but pests like damp, warm conditions generally. So we need to make sure that in order to discourage pests, we prevent damp, warm conditions. So I'm not saying we've got to have very dry conditions, very low temperatures, but ideally we'd have, you know, below 60% RH. So anything mid-range RH would be great. So not damp, not dry, but in the middle. And then high temperatures, obviously we need to look into visitor comfort and staff comfort, but ideally we shouldn't be getting above 20, 21 degrees. So that's comfortable, but it's not overly encouraging pests to reproduce. And then obviously good housekeeping. So I've said pests coming for food and harbourage. Obviously we can't remove the collection, which they do use as food, but we can remove all that dust and other potential food sources and harbourage. So good housekeeping, removing dust, making sure things are tidy so you can see where dust builds up, making sure there's no hidden spaces. So what I was saying earlier, under floorboards and chimneys, make sure you can access and check these places, clear them out, because pests can get there, and if they're not clear, then they could harbour pests. Make sure there's no random stuff hanging about your museum, so things that have been deaccessioned or just rubbish, empty cardboard boxes, paper, that could be used by pests. and could encourage them to live in your museum. Make sure there's regular inspections for cleanliness and for damage. Particularly in less frequented areas such as attics and cellars, make sure you're checking them regularly, because they are sources for pests, but also birds, so birds' nests, and then you increase the risk of insect pests as well. So obviously, as we're trying to reduce food and harbourage for pests, we often make it compulsory that no food and drink is consumed in collection areas. Even if you're careful, little fragments of food can drop on the floor, and this can encourage pests. Where there's bins, make sure that these bins are secure and are regularly emptied, because pests can access these and live off the food inside. And it's important, I said, that things brought in, such as loaned objects, accessioned objects, and also props, so things like the dressing up clothes that I mentioned. It's important that you not only quarantine objects that come in to make sure they're not infested, but also anything else that any other teams bring in, so that could be infested. So dressing up clothing, props, make sure they're checked and quarantined if there's problems. And it's also important to train staff to identify signs. So there might just be you in your museum who's in charge of IPM, but if you have some room stewards or volunteers and they're keen, you know, they're excited about the collection, they're keen to look after it, it would be great to harness their usefulness and train them to identify little signs of damage or pest debris that they can then report, and then they're helping you to prevent pests. So as we were talking about chimneys earlier, this is a chimney that I believe they thought was capped, and it was obviously capped at the bottom, so it had been sealed over. But this is all the debris that was up the chimney when they cleared it out. And obviously this is the accumulation of many birds' nests over years, and dust and debris. And this is great for pests such as carpet beetle and spider beetles and moths, because they can live off all of that, because there'll be remains of other insects and remains of animals in there that they can live off. So there's a lot to think about there with prevention. So lots of, hopefully you've got loads of ideas of how you can go back to your museum and start thinking about all them things. And it's not a quick fix. They are all ongoing things that you have to monitor. So don't worry about, oh, I've got to do all of this now. It's about making sure these procedures are in place, so that after a while they just keep going and keep monitoring themselves, and hopefully that will reduce your risk of pest infestation. But as well as that, thinking about prevention, it's also important to think about monitoring and recording. So we've talked a bit about this, signs of pest activity, and these are things that you can train your helpers to look for as well, if you can get helpers from room stewards and volunteers. So these are what you need to look out for when monitoring pest activity in your museum. So if you notice any live pests, so particularly any beetles near windows that are attracted to light, or moths flying around. Also dead pests and cases. So if things have been eating the collection, then you might find dead pests nearby, or the woolly bear cases that I was talking about. And most pests leave behind a trail of frass, which I was talking about. so the little pellets or little grainy frass, and these will be near, on or below objects, which can be quite visible. And then obviously you've got the last sign of pest activity, which is actual damage to objects. This can be harder to spot if you've caught it early, but it's always worthwhile checking vulnerable objects quite regularly to see if there's any damage. So it's important to keep an eye on your collections for all them signs, but it's also important to undertake regular monitoring. So I'm sure you are probably all familiar with the kinds of monitoring. So we've got a blunder trap on the left. So blunder traps do as they say on the tin. They are sticky traps, and they catch anything that just blunders into their area. So it's often important to put these against walls, on the floor, in corners, because that's where pests like to travel. They don't tend to go across the floor, they tend to go around the corners. And they, as they walk past, they get stuck, and you are able to count up what gets stuck and therefore see if you have a problem. And it is normal to have some small level of pest activity. It's very hard to eradicate everything. It's more if you get a substantial number over a substantial time period of pests appearing on your traps again and again. That's when you need to take action and think we've got a problem. So it's important to undertake regular monitoring. And on the right, we've got a pheromone trap, which mentioned in regard to one of the questions earlier. So this, I believe, is a web-enclosed moth, although sometimes hard to tell. Pheromone trap, obviously it's caught a lot of moths there. So if you show me that trap, I'd said you'd probably have a problem with moths, and you'd probably need to do something about it, because that's a lot of moths. So pheromone traps give off a chemical that attracts a specific type of pest to the trap. So unlike the blunder trap, which is just giving a snapshot of what blunders across its path, these traps actually attract the insect that you're wanting. So if you do have a problem, you're likely to get a lot of the creatures trapped. But they are very, very good, because moths don't often get, well, they do get trapped on blunder traps, but as they're a flighting creature, they are less likely to, you're less likely to see the extent of the infestation. So pheromone traps for moths in particular, it's important to not necessarily put them on the floor, put them maybe higher up, where moths are likely to fly past. So these catches, once you've caught them, it's important to identify what you've got on the traps. So that might be easy. If you've got a pheromone trap, you're most likely only going to get what you're trying to catch on them traps. You might get occasionally something that's wandered on by accident, but you're more than likely going to end up with the web enclosed moth or whatever moth you wanted to attract. So you can use, there are USB microscopes that can be used to identify, hand lenses. Because all these pests are very small, it's useful to have some sort of magnification. So obviously it's useful to have the correct trap for the correct pest. Blunder traps can be used for as a snapshot for any pest, but obviously, like I said, pheromone traps have to be used for a specific pest. And there's also, not used so much in this country, I don't think at the moment, but in Europe, they are moving on to light traps. So things like, I said, cigarette beetles and biscuit beetles, when they turn into beetles, are attracted to light. So you might often find them on windowsills. These traps emit light, not so much that it would affect collections, but that it would attract these beetles, so that it's a bit like a pheromone trap in that it attracts a certain type of beetle or insect pest, but it doesn't use a chemical to do that, it uses the light attraction. So they do exist. If you do have a bat problem, not bat problem, but if you do have bats in your museum, you may, for bat protection, you may have to put your traps in bat cages or bat-proof traps, because obviously bats are protected, you don't want to hurt them, and they can get stuck on blunder traps and things like that. So you can buy cages to put your traps in, which won't affect collecting data on insect pests, but it will prevent bats from getting trapped. So like I said, it's important to put them in suitable locations, on the floor, up high, wherever is necessary for your pest. And it's not to put out too many traps. So you want to adequately monitor the area, but you don't want it to take all your time. So you need as many traps as it'll take to get a clear picture, but not so many that you're not going to be able to monitor them regularly. And usually regularly we mean, and most places check their traps once every 3 months, so 4 times a year, record their data, and then you can then see the patterns that emerge over the year. And it's important to date traps and make sure you know when they were put out, when the pests were caught. So don't count the pests more than once. And make sure you plan where your traps are so that you will be able to find them again. Make sure people know not to pick them up and take them. So there are lots of free resources to help you with this. If you're used to doing IPM, you'll have this poster, no doubt. If you don't have this poster, then it's available to download for free on the English Heritage website. So it's got just clear pictures of every pest and the size of the pest, so it's very useful. There's also websites that can help, so free websites. This is What's Eating Your Collection, so it has information about each of the pests, clear pictures, clear information, and it also has guidance on monitoring, so where to place your traps if you're worried about where you're placing traps to get the best data, and things like that. And again, museumspest.net is another resource, and these have very good PDF fact sheets about each pest. So if you look at them, you'll see a lot of the same information that I gave you on identification. So don't worry if you didn't get all that, it's all here. And if you're really interested in IPM, you can join the pest list. So this is a list that has everyone in it who's interested in IPM. You can send a question into the group, and you'll often have museum professionals from international museums and entomologists answering that question for you. So if you ever have a problem, then that's a really great resource. And so it's important to record your findings, and there's lots of free resources online. So this is the English Heritage example of how to record your pest data. You can download for free, or you can make yourself a bespoke version on Excel, whatever works for you. But it's important to save all that information so you can get an infestation history and make decisions. And then you can do things like this, plot on floor plans, and make sure, see what's at risk, where your pest results are, and see if you've got a pest problem. So I realise I've talked a lot so far about pests and identification. I'm just going to briefly finish with treatment, and I know I'm running it over slightly, so I apologise. Pests, you can get very distracted by pests once you get into it, so hopefully 5 minutes and we'll be done. So in-house treatment, we were talking a bit about this. So quarantine, it's important to quarantine any affected objects that you find, so to prevent the infestation from spreading. So it'd be great if you have in your museum a room or a cupboard or somewhere where you can put quarantined objects that are separate from collection objects. Also, it's important to make sure that you clean the object and around the object when you find the pest treatment, so to remove pest debris and pests themselves, so that they don't reinfest the object once you've done other treatment. And you can consult a conservator if you're worried about cleaning anything that's vulnerable. And we mentioned before constrain, so there's chemical treatments, so permethrin sprays, particularly constrain, which has been approved for use on collections, so it shouldn't damage collection objects. So you, if you have a particularly bad infestation, you can spray on objects, or you can inject using a syringe into flight holes in objects. But again, some people find it really useful and it works. Some people doubt that it's quite as effective as it used to be. But it is difficult to get a insecticide that is legal, safe to use, and safe to use on collections. So it's a difficult area. So there are other release agents, repellents and insecticides, but you do have to make sure whatever you use is legal, safe, and safe for collections. Many people use so lavender scents, which are meant to repel moths. So that's an example of something that's safe to use and should make some sort of impact. Freezing is an important treatment as well. So pests cannot survive below a certain temperature. It's not suitable for all objects. Some vulnerable objects are not allowed to be frozen, so it's important to make sure you research what can and can't be frozen. It's important you have the right freezers for the job, so no self-defrost freezers, and a freezer that can get down to a temperature within 24 hours. The object needs to be fully sealed in a plastic bag with an absorbent material such as tissue paper, so that it prevents condensation from forming. And then, dependent on what your freezer can accomplish, it needs to be in for 48 hours to 2 weeks, depending on how low your freezer can go. And it's important to leave once it's out of the freezer, it's important to leave it to return to room temperature before unwrapping. So normally this would be about 2 weeks. And then we've talked about a few of these in the questions before, alternative treatments. These are generally things that you might consult a professional or a conservator or an entomologist on, because they might need more support. So gender confusion, I think we covered that in the question about disrupting the life cycle. You may have read in the national news about what the National Trust are doing with micro wasps. These are very small wasps that eat moths and shouldn't contribute to other pest problems. So I would advise reading that article if you can find it, BBC News, very interesting. If you have rodent problems, they are generally dealt with professional trappers, something like Rent-A-Kill or any other pest catching, rodent catching contractors. Again, like freezing, pests can't survive in non-oxygen environments, so you have things like carbon dioxide and anoxia treatment, so eradicating oxygen so that they die. And lastly, heat treatment, or sometimes called thermolignin. Pests also cannot survive at very, very high temperatures, but obviously this has got to be done very carefully, because obviously collection might suffer at high temperatures as well. So I think that's me done with all the talking, and if there are questions, I'm sorry I've gone a bit over time there. I got dug into the pests, but if we are allowed questions and we can take questions, I'm happy to do that, or I can answer questions later.
Well, I'll read out the questions. I do understand it's now 11:33, so I do understand if people have to sign off, but we have about 4 or 5 questions in the chat. So let's go through them and see where we can get. So the first question is, is, here we go. Will a coconut mat at an entrance do the same job as a bristle strip?
A coconut mat would might remove pests from people's shoes, but it won't necessarily stop them from getting inside. Are we talking about a bristle mat outside? If the bristle mat's outside, then maybe it might prevent their access. Yes, it would. Obviously, I don't know for certain. I've not experimented, but I would imagine that it would remove pests from people's shoes, potentially if they had them on the bottom of their shoes, just as they remove dirt, and it might make their ingress more difficult. So yes, like bristle strips, they might find it hard to transverse across that uneven plane. However, if they did make it to the door and there wasn't a bristle strip, they might be able to get into the door, but I would imagine it would prevent, help with the prevention. So certainly, yeah, that's a good idea.
Do you have any advice on how to control temperature and damp in relation to the airflow required to be COVID safe? In the warm days of autumn, we were required to have our doors open, and it made it near impossible to control these factors. Is this just unavoidable? Yeah,
that's a difficult one, which I know we also sort of talked about in the environmental control training. COVID and health and safety will always trump collection safety. So if it is necessary, obviously to avoid microclimates and things like that, we might introduce fans into collections and stuff, but we can't do that at the moment because of airflow and spreading COVID. And obviously we need windows and doors open for COVID. So it's about making sure people are safe and mitigating where we can what that might mean for collections. So if we need to open windows and doors, can we put something in place that would, so something like what I mentioned in that slide, a gauze over window, a fly net over windows to prevent beetles coming in but still allow airflow. Microclimate wise, yeah, it's difficult without fans and increasing. It's difficult, isn't it? Because COVID wants airflow, but it doesn't want it in a particular direction, so it doesn't take COVID particles with it. Yeah, I think it's just about making the necessary changes for COVID, but also thinking what that means about collections. So if it is, I think at this moment we've got to monitor and see what changes that instills, and then try and make decisions after we know exactly what's happening, if that makes sense, if you've got monitoring equipment available.
Okay. Next question was more for me. Do you, the Southeast Museum program team, collate and share IPM, so that's insect and pest management data, from museums across the region at all? I'm afraid we don't. We don't have the capacity to do that. There are about 300 museums in the Southeast in our region, and we don't have a permanent preventive conservation officer on our team anymore. So we work with Spencer and Fry to offer lots of services. So I'm afraid we don't collate that information. Is there a website that could tell us what sorts of pests are common to the area? Do pests work that way? Is it regional, or is it more about the food source within your museum and the microclimates in your museum?
Yeah, some pests are regional. Most of the ones I've mentioned appear wherever in the United Kingdom that food sources and environment allow. I did say things like Death Watch. When I worked in Scotland, it hadn't yet got to Scotland because of the different environment in Scotland. But I don't know whether that's still the case. I think it possibly is. I think it's just a bit too cold. So in the north of England and Scotland, you're less likely to get Death Watch. Also for the newer species, grey silverfish and what's the other one I said, the vodka beetle, they've very recently been introduced. So it's not necessarily about the climate, but more about maybe national museums that have taken international loans where things have come in from other international museums, I believe. So I think they can spread to other areas. It's just they haven't had the chance. I'm not sure about specific. I don't know for certain, but I think Museum Pests, the website, might have something about regional. I certainly know, I think there is a work being done on trying to pinpoint nationally where there have been outbreaks of things, but I don't think they've published anything yet or come to any conclusions.
There are 5 more questions in the chat. So we use sticky blender traps in the storerooms and don't seem to have much of a problem. Is there something else we should use in cases?
Not necessarily. Some people don't trap in cases at all because they curatorially they don't like traps in cases, and they think that actually there's not much in cases. We'll keep a visual eye on things, so that's okay. But if you have a lot of things in cases, a lot of textiles, I'd be tempted to keep a trap in there just in case, at least to monitor for a little bit and then to make a decision as to whether you're finding things or not. Depending on what you have in the case, blunder traps are fine. If you're particularly worried about textiles, I'd put a pheromone trap in. Or if you think you can have a look visually for things, then that's fine as well, as long as you do make a record of regular visits and stuff. If that answers that question.
Okay. Which is thought to be more effective, injecting wood with constrain or spraying the surface?
Because the larvae eat and tunnel into the wood, sometimes if you spray the surface, it doesn't reach the insect you're trying to kill. So I know people generally, if you're dealing with a boring insect, not a boring insect, an insect that bores rather than a dull insect, then it's generally more useful to inject into the holes for it to reach the insect you're trying to get. Although if you spray in spring when they're emerging, then you may be okay and you may get the beetles on their way out. But obviously they have already done the damage then, but then again, they hopefully might die before they reproduce. So you might want to do a bit of both, depending on how big your problem is. Yeah.
Why can't you use a self-defrost freezer for freezing infected objects?
I'm not completely scientific, but I believe it's because a self-defrosting freezer doesn't, so a normal freezer, when you put something in, it goes down to the temperature and it keeps it there. There's something about the cycle of a self-defrosting freezer that means I think the temperature undulates, and then it increases the risk of condensation forming within the object, which is what we don't want, because we don't want the moisture content of the object to change. So I believe that's the reason, in a very unscientific way. I'm sure I can probably find something more scientific and put that in the handout notes, but I believe it's to do with the moisture content of the condensation of the object. It's not particularly great.
We have a 4-poster bed that has woodworm, but is so delicate we can't dismantle and put it in thermoligman chamber. Any suggestions?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. You can, if you're on about thermoligman, then you might have resources. So it might be possible. I think English Heritage has done something on this. So I was talking about anoxia and carbon dioxide treatments. It might be possible to build an in situ bubble and then do something like anoxia or carbon dioxide treatment in situ, which may help. I can maybe try and dig out some more information on that. But that aside, it may only be constrain and housekeeping that may keep the levels down. If you can't deconstruct it, then I'm guessing you can't actually get it out of the property. You may find a freezer that's big enough to put the whole thing in, but obviously if you can't deconstruct and get it out of the building, there's no point getting a big freezer. Yeah, so I'll maybe have a little look into what English Heritage were doing with, I think it was English Heritage. Yeah, but you can build bubbles in situ, so I can maybe find a bit more out for you.
We've got 2 more questions. Do you have any advice, or can you point to any good online advice to perform deep cleans on storage areas? I'll just pop in. I know that Spencer and Fry did a session for us a few months ago, specifically about deep cleaning, and we have that session recorded, and we also have some notes around that. So I can send that out to you, Joanne, but I don't know if Charlotte has any other.
Yes, yeah, as well as that, I think there will be things on the English Heritage Conservation website, as well as Collections Trust. So anywhere, and probably Icon as well, might have some deep cleaning resources. But I can certainly put a few links on the handout.
And our last question is, are mothballs to be recommended since they're strongly scented?
I think you've got to be careful with mothballs, because I think what used to be called mothballs are now illegal, or at least the chemical they used to use in mothballs. The new, I think they might have, I don't know a lot about mothballs, to be honest with you, but I believe there are things that might have replaced mothballs that are now used. So I know some museums use lavender scented things in place of where they used to use mothballs, but I can again do a little bit more digging on that, because I'm not quite up to date with what in terms of mothballs there are and what's legal and what's not at the moment. But I know the original chemical they used to use in mothballs is now health and safety reasons not allowed.